Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to Anatomy here at Chaminade University. Today we will be going over chapter 14, where we are talking about the organization of the human brain. So the purpose of this chapter is for you to understand the organization of the brain, how it's protected, how it is organized, and how it is supplied with vasculature and blood supply. We're also going to compare and contrast the different areas of the brain and discuss their functions, and talk about the overall functional organization of the brain. And last but not least, we'll talk about cranial nerves, their structure, and the individual functions. Now, as you may know, the brain is the center for registering sensations and correlating them with one another, and with stored information and with making decisions and taking actions, etc. And it's also the center for your intellect, your emotions, your behavior, and your memory. So before we get started, let's take an overview, a look at the different principal parts of the brain. The major parts of the brain include the brain stem. That's going to be down here. That's going to include the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So that's this whole region here, medulla oblongata, the pons headed up into the midbrain. That's all called the brainstem. We also have the diencephalon. The diencephalon is going to be here. That's going to include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which is going to be the pineal gland, is going to be part of the epithalamus. And we also have the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So the cerebrum is going to be the frontal part here, and the cerebellum is found here towards the back. They've got completely different texture and composition, so you should pretty much automatically be able to orient yourself when you're looking at a section of the brain just by noticing the difference in the way that the cerebellum appears from the cerebrum. And then, of course, we have some distinctive characteristics here with this hindbrain region. All right, so moving forward, the brain is protected by multiple different layers. It's going to be protected first by the cranial bones and then also by the cranial meninges. You may have heard of these previously when we talked about the spinal column and the spinal meninges, and we talked about an infection of the meninges being meningitis. But just like we found in the spinal column, we have three major layers of the meninges: the pia, the arachnoid, and the dura mater. However, in the cranial meninges, the dura mater is actually split into two separate layers. That's going to be the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer, and we'll look at those in just a minute. And then we also have the cerebrospinal fluid, or you might see that later on just denoted as CSF. It's a clear liquid that's going to help protect and nourish the brain. All right, so if we take a frontal plane here through the top of the brain and start looking, we have several different layers of protective regions. First, obviously, we have the skin that's going to cover the parietal bone, or the skull bone here. And as we head down, we hit first the cranial meninges. We're going to hit the dura mater. As I mentioned, that's split into two layers. That outermost layer is the periosteal layer, and that innermost layer here is the meningeal layer. And then as we follow that down, we're going to hit the arachnoid mater and the pia mater as well. And then we'll head into the cerebral cortex directly under that. That dura mater is actually split into these separate extensions that are going to separate the different regions of the brain. One of those is depicted here. That's the falx cerebri, and we'll look at some of the other ones in just a second. But they also include so the falx cerebri, the falx cerebri, and the tentorium cerebelli. All right, so this is what I was just talking about. There are these extensions that come out of the dura mater. So here's the dura mater here. These extensions are actually going to separate out the different regions of the brain. So here's the falx cerebri, here's the falx cerebelli, and here's the tentorium cerebelli, and they're going to separate the three major regions. So the falx cerebri is going to separate the two different cerebral hemispheres from one another. The falx cerebelli is going to separate the cerebellar hemispheres from one another, and the tentorium cerebelli is going to separate the cerebellum from the cerebrum. All right, so those are the extensions of the dura mater and how they separate the different regions of the brain. Okay, so now we're going to talk about blood flow. We're going to talk about the blood-brain barrier. As you may know, the brain is fairly small compared to the rest of the body. It's only about 2% of the total body weight. Most of that is fluids, but it takes up and consumes about 20% of the oxygen used by the entire body, and that's because it's going to need a lot of energy, and it's going to be doing a lot of things. It basically is directing or orchestrating all of the body's functions. However, the brain is not really able to store a bunch of food molecules, so it's not able to store carbohydrates or glucose, etc. So the neurons synthesize ATP perpetually by using reactions that use up oxygen. So we're going to need to get a lot of oxygen into the brain itself. And that means that the supply of the food supply, including glucose and also oxygen, has to be continuous into the brain. So the blood-brain barrier has to let things in that are supposed to be let in, like glucose and oxygen, and keep things out that it wants to keep out, right? And so we get blood flow into the brain, but that blood is not going to actually go directly into the brain. The blood's going to reach a barrier whereby liquid's going to seep out of the blood and into the brain. But let's talk about blood flow. So blood's going to flow into the brain through the vertebral and carotid arteries, right? And then it's going to flow back into the sorry, the carotid arteries over here, internal carotid and external carotid. And then it's going to flow back out through the jugular veins, right? Anytime you see red, you know you're talking about arteries. Blue, you're talking about veins. Again, the brain uses most of the body's oxygen supply, over 20% of the oxygen supply, even though it's only going to take about 2% of the body weight. And if we have even a slight interruption of the oxygen supply, we can end up with brain damage, brain weakening, permanent damage, or even brain death. This can also happen if we have limitations of glucose. So if you have a sugar deficiency, you can end up being mentally addled or confused. Sometimes dizziness or even epileptic seizures, unconsciousness can also occur. So you need to make sure that we're getting the glucose and the oxygen supply into the brain. However, we have to make sure that we are keeping other things out. So we have this blood-brain barrier, which is comprised of tight junctions. And it's going to make sure that only certain things get through. So it's going to protect the brain cells from harmful substances and pathogens such as microbes. So it's a selective barrier that's going to allow certain things in but keep other things out. And this actually has been kind of an issue with neurobiologists if they're trying to get drugs into the brain, for example, because that blood-brain barrier is very effective at keeping out what it doesn't want to let in. And so it can prevent the entry of certain therapeutic drugs. And if you end up with injuries to the brain, sometimes you can end up having an issue with that blood-brain barrier, and that can allow certain things that are normally restricted into the brain tissue, which can cause a cascade of all sorts of abnormal effects. Um, So the cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colorless liquid, and it's a protective layer. It protects the brain and the spinal cord against chemical and physical injuries, and it also carries things in to the cells like oxygen and glucose and other important substances from the blood into the nervous tissue. All right, so we have 4 major cavities that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. These are called ventricles. Similar to what you hear when you talk about the heart, right? They're just going to be cavities that are filled with liquid, and they look like this. So here's our 2 lateral ventricles. And here's our 4th ventricle here and our 3rd ventricle here. So any of the cerebrospinal fluid that comes in is going to filter through all of these regions. So basically what happens is cerebrospinal fluid is constantly being created and also constantly being absorbed. And there's a filtration through the network of these capillaries. These capillaries are called choroid plexuses or plexus. They're going to be found in those ventricles. And they circulate throughout that subarachnoid space that we just talked about, the ventricles, and also in the central canal. So anything that comes in from that central cerebrospinal fluid from those going to be coming in from the choroid capillaries, it can't leak between the epidermal cells that are constituting that blood-brain barrier. And that means that certain things are able to come in and other things are not able to come in. And then also that fluid that is being leaked out is also being reabsorbed. So it's going to be absorbed by the arachnoid villi that's in the superior sagittal blood sinus. And that usually happens at the same rate that the fluid is created. So we have a normal pressure, right? If we create fluid at the same rate that we absorb the fluid, we're going to have a constant pressure of cerebrospinal fluid, also a constant volume as well. And the pathway for circulation is basically like this. So it goes through the lateral ventricles first. Then it goes through the foramina between the intraventricular space, right? In the foramina are the different intraventicular foramen, right? As it follows through there, then it goes into this 3rd ventricle. From there, it goes through an aqueduct to the midbrain. That's called the cerebral aqueduct here. And then it's going to go to the 4th ventricle, which is here. Okay, and then from that 4th ventricle, it's then going to go to the medial and lateral apertures, which are found here. Is the lateral one and the medial one. And then from that, it's going to go back into the subarachnoid space and get absorbed in by the arachnoid villi. Oh, sorry. So let's talk about the brainstem for a second. The brainstem is comprised of 3 different major sections. It's going to include the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So what do they look like? Here's our medulla oblongata. And then here is the pons. And then here is one of the peduncles of the midbrain. So here's the midbrain right there. So the medulla oblongata, you can sometimes just call it the medulla. It's basically going to be continuous with the upper part of the spinal column. So the upper part of the spinal column is going to feed right into this medulla oblongata. You can see this is the spinal cord here, spinal nerve C1, so we're right at the spinal column. That's feeding right into the medulla oblongata. And it's going to contain different motor and sensory tracts of the white matter and a ton of nuclei as well. And eventually some of the white matter is going to form these bulges. Those bulges are called pyramids. So you're going to see several different sets of pyramids here, and they're basically described by their shape. And these pyramids are going to be at the very back region, or the anterior aspects of the medulla. So that is right around here. Come on, right here, pyramids. All right, and this is where we're going to have the origin of cranial nerves that are going to be coming out here. Okay, so the medulla oblongata, again, it connects all the way back to the spinal cord and contains different portions of both motor and sensory tracts, similar to what the spinal column is seeing. And so here we have different regions. Here's those pyramids that we were talking about previously. They're going to kind of poke right out of the anterior region. And then we also are going to start seeing some of the cranial nerves. So here's a vagus nerve, here's a hypoglossal nerve. All of those nerves are going to be numbered 1 through 10, but they're going to be numbered in Roman numerals. Okay, so some of the cranial nerves we talk about are going to be the vestibular cochlear and the hypoglossal. We'll also talk about the optic nerve and the olfactory nerve. All of these are different cranial nerves. We also have, so the cranial nerves that come out of the medulla oblongata are going to be the vestibular cochlear and the hypoglossal nerves. Some of the structural regions to talk about in the medulla oblongata are those pyramids that we just talked about. And then there's also a series of nuclei that are in the inferior region that are shaped like olives, so the inferior olivary nuclei. I'm not sure if they're named that because they're shaped like olives, but that's how I remember what they are. And then the functional regions of the medulla oblongata are going to include different things like heart rate, respiratory rate, vasoconstriction, swallowing, vomiting, sneezing, hiccuping, coughing. So things that you think of as very basal brainstem things, right? That's the medulla oblongata is responsible for things like heart rate and respiratory rate. All right, so the pons is located superior to the medulla, and it's going to contain motor and sensory tracts, just like we saw previously, and it's going to link different parts of the brain to one another by way of these different tracts. All right, so here's what the medulla oblongata looks like, going right up into the pons, going right up into the midbrain. All of this is considered to be the brain stem. All right, so the major regions include the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum, and the diencephalon. All right, so if we're looking at the pons, the cranial nerves that come out of the pons are going to include the trigeminal nerves, the abductens, facial, and vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. And the vestibular cochlear nerve is going to deal with balance and equilibrium. Balance and equilibrium are one thing, that's the vestibular branch, and the cochlear would be hearing. So both hearing and equilibrium are going to be tied in through this one particular nerve. So what's the purpose of the pons? The functional regions of the pons is that we're going to be relaying nerve impulses. And they're going to be most of the voluntary skeletal muscle motions from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So information is going to get passed back and forth between these two regions by way of the pons. And it's in control of pneumotaxic and apnoistic areas. These are the regions of the brain that are in control of respiration, so breathing. All right, so as we follow through the midbrain, we're going to hit to the midbrain. The midbrain is located superior to the medulla oblongata and is going to extend from the pons region to the diencephalon region. And this is where we're going to see more nerves coming forward. Here we're going to see, if you're looking forward, going upward. Here's the brain, the spinal cord coming in. Here we have spinal nerve C1, so this is the very top of the spinal column, entering up here. That's going to continue rising up until we get to different nerves. So we have the accessory nerve, the vagus nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, vestibular cochlear nerve, facial nerve, etc. And then here we have some peduncles. We have the middle cerebral peduncle, this is again in the cerebrum, and then the inferior cerebral peduncle. And then we follow forward, we're going to hit another nerve. Here's the trochlear nerve. Here's another cerebral peduncle. And then following forward from that, we're going to get up into the thalamus region. And we'll talk about the thalamus and the pineal gland when we talk about, mainly we'll talk about that in 152 when we talk about its regulation of all sorts of different types of exocrine secretion. So it's going to regulate a lot of things that are secreted into the blood supply. All right, so as we're looking through some of the midbrain, we also see new cranial nerves coming through. So here we have the ocular motor and the trochlear nerve. Some of the structural regions that are going to be of interest are those peduncles that I just talked about. So we have the cerebral peduncles. Here's one. Those kind of look like, I'm not really sure exactly how to describe them, kind of like paintbrushes perhaps. So we have these regions that are going to be kind of extensions, and then we have this red nuclei region. So red nucleus region here, and the substantia nigra region here, which is kind of like the smile, if you were to look at this as the eyeballs and the smile of a smiley face. As we're following up here, we're going to reach this region as the aqueduct of the midbrain. And as you remember, as we talked about the cerebrospinal fluid going from one section to the other, this is the aqueduct that's going to conduct the cerebrospinal fluid from one section to another. Okay, so the functional regions of the midbrain is that the midbrain is responsible for conveying motor impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and back again, and also to the spinal cord, so communication between these regions, and also sends sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus. And the thalamus and the hypothalamus, as I mentioned previously, they're going to be regulating different secretion of molecules that are going to help regulate a lot of different things in the body. It's also going to help regulate the auditory and the visual reflexes. All right, so this is that same image that we just saw up here. We're just going to kind of zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to say the same things I just said, but give you a little bit more detail. So again, these are the cerebral peduncles here and here. On this outer region, what would be the paintbrush of my previous analogy, are the corticospinal, corticopontine, and cortical bulbar axons. So it's going to have a lot of axonal neurons basically running through here, axons of neurons running through here. And then if you go forward, we have the substantia nigra, and this is a very easily defined region because it actually is going to be red in color. Coming forward, we're going to have these are going to be a red nucleus. On the outside, we have medial geniculate nuclei. And then here's a nerve coming out. This is the ocular motor nerve, or cranial nerve 3. Again, as we follow forward, we're going to get that aqueduct or cerebrospinal fluid goes back and forth. And then around that, we have the periaqueductal gray matter. All right. And now if we look at the reticular formation, I'm going to step back a little bit. So here's the reticular formation shown here. I apologize, I didn't mention that. That's another kind of like a red matter area that's going to run longitudinally. And that reticular formation here is going to run all the way along the medulla oblongata, across the pons, and then into the early stages of the midbrain. And it's going to help regulate a lot of different parts of the body. So it's going to have a lot of crosstalk, helping regulate things like muscle tone. Also going to be responsible for your circadian rhythm and maintaining when you are awake and when you are asleep, and maintaining your conscious matter, right? So the reticular formation is a broad net-like region that extends from the superior part of the spinal cord all the way through the brainstem and into the inferior part of the diencephalon up in here. And it is going to be comprised of gray matter interspersed among fibers of white matter with both sensory and motor functions. And the ascending portion of the reticular formation is going to be called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. So you may hear me talk about the RAS a little bit later, and that's what's responsible for the awakening from sleep, so becoming conscious. So if you damage this region, you can end up with issues with maintaining consciousness, something like narcolepsy, or also something like just issues with awakening from sleep. And then also you could perhaps end up in a coma if we end up with severe damage to this region. And the descending portion of this reticular formation helps regulate what we mentioned previously: muscle tone, skeletal muscle tone, heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. All right, so let's summarize the functions of the principal parts of the brain. So we have the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, that's found here. The pons, which is found just a little bit above that, or superior to it, superior to this. We have the midbrain. Okay, medulla oblongata is going to have both sensory and motor tracts. It's going to be responsible for the cardiovascular center, so it's responsible for heartbeat and blood vessel diameter, so vasodilation, etc., or constriction. Also responsible for the respiratory center, but that's in combination with the pons. The pons is basically going to be mainly responsible for respiratory, has the pontine respiratory group, etc., to help control your breathing. And then the midbrain, also sensory and motor tracts, and it's going to help coordinate the vision, so your eyes, your head, trunk, etc., in response to visual stimuli. And it's also going to help contribute to control of your emotion as well. Okay, so let's move on to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is going to occupy the inferior and posterior, so at the bottom and towards the back region of the cranial cavity. And it's going to have two hemispheres here, cerebral hemisphere, one and the other, and a central vermis. So this here's the vermis region. This is going to connect the two cerebellar hemispheres. All right. So the cerebellum is going to be functional in coordinating your muscular activities. So it's going to coordinate your skeletal muscle contractions, and it's going to help you maintain muscle tone, posture, and balance, etc. So the most superficial layer is called the cerebral cortex. That's going to be here. I think I've gotten lost in my notes here. I think I'm a little bit off, or I'm missing a slide. So I guess we'll move on here to the diencephalon. The diencephalon is going to be comprised of three different regions: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And although you haven't really heard the word epithalamus before, you probably are familiar with the pineal gland, which is part of that epithalamus. So the thalamus is going to be located superior to the midbrain, so further up the midbrain. And it has it's going to be here. Thalamus right there, and it's going to be located just on top of the hypothalamus, and we're going to see that there's a little bit of crosstalk between the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And the thalamus is going to have nuclei that serve as relay stations for all of your sensory impulses except for the sense of smell into the cerebral cortex. And there are several different types, 7 major groups of nuclei on either side of the thalamus, which you are not going to need to know for the exam. But just be aware that there are axons that connect the thalamus and the cerebrum, and they're going to pass through a region called the internal capsule, which is, I guess, not depicted here, but that's going to be where we're going to have a strong region, a network of neurons. Okay, so here is the thalamus. It's located superior to the midbrain, so above the midbrain. It has multiple sets of nuclei. Again, it's got 7 different sets of nuclei on each side. Again, you're not going to need to know which ones they are, but the nuclei are going to serve as relay stations for all of your sensory impulses except the sense of smell into the cerebral cortex. I don't see the capsule here either. Interesting. So the regions that, again, you're not going to need to know all of them, but the regions of the thalamus are going to include these. We have a reticular region, right? We have a medial region, both the anterior region and a lateral, a posterior, and ventral posterior region. Here's a ventral lateral region, etc. And each of these are going to be relaying information into the cerebral cortex. So the hypothalamus is found inferior to the thalamus, or just below the thalamus, and it has 4 major regions. And it's going to be responsible for controlling many of the body's activities, and it is a homeostatic regulator. So when I said previously it's going to help with regulation of a lot of different pathways, I wasn't joking. It's going to regulate a lot of different parts of homeostatic pathways. And the 4 major regions are that mammillary, the tuberal, the supraoptic, and the preoptic regions. And the multiple functions of the hypothalamus include regulation of emotion and behavior, regulation of eating and drinking, so hunger and thirst, and satiation. So there's a satiation center that's going to decide that you are no longer hungry, and also helps regulate body temperature, circadian rhythm, and different states of consciousness. So are you going to need to know all of the different regions? No, but you need to know that information comes in from a lot of different areas, and it's going to be responsible for regulating many different factors of homeostatic conditions. So if we look superior, or just above and posterior, so just above and behind the thalamus, we're going to find the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is going to contain the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is going to help secrete melatonin. So you may have heard of this in terms of how your circadian rhythm. Melatonin helps you relax and go to sleep. It also is going to have habenular nuclei, and these are involved in olfaction. Okay, so as you may have mentioned previously, the sensory impulses that come in through the thalamus are everything except smell. And what happens is with the sense of smell is that it's going to be going through the epithalamus. All right. Actually, what's interesting is it's not just involved in olfaction or the sense of smell. It's actually involved with the emotional response to odors. So sometimes you can smell something and it triggers a specific memory, or with some people with PTSD, it can trigger a severe emotional response. And that's all going to be going through the epithalamus region. Okay, so we also have specialty organs of the diencephalon that are called circumventricular organs. Those are CVOs. And these CVOs are basically chemical monitors. They monitor chemical changes in the blood, and they do not have a blood-brain barrier, so they are able to determine the changes in the blood, whereas the brain is going to be sheltered a little bit from these changes because of the blood-brain barrier. And CVOs actually include part of the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, and a couple of the other nearby structures, and their job is to coordinate all of the homeostatic activities of both the endocrine and the nervous systems. And incidentally, they're also thought to be the site of entry of HIV into the brain because, again, certain things are not able to go across that blood-brain barrier. That's going to include viruses, but because this region doesn't have a blood-brain barrier, and viruses are able to get to it and cause infection. Okay, so we're going to continue summarizing the different principal parts of the brain. So here we're looking at the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, all of which have a little bit of regulatory crosstalk. And again, the thalamus is responsible for regulating all sensory input, almost all sensory input into the cerebral cortex. The only exception to that, obviously, is olfaction. It's also contributing to motor functions and plays a role in maintenance of consciousness, or whether or not you are awake or asleep, or perhaps comatose if it's badly damaged. The hypothalamus is going to help control autonomic nervous system, so ANS things, including hormones. We'll talk about this extensively. That's why chapter 15 is actually what we're going to start 152 on, and it's going to talk about a lot of things that are hormones that are going to be secreted or produced by the hypothalamus and the thalamus. That's going to include things like that are inhibitors or releasing hormones of particular molecules, also things like ADH, which is involved in water reuptake, oxytocin, you may have heard of that as the love chemical, etc. I'm not going to ask you these specifics, but it's involved in the release of a lot of different hormones and biomolecules that are going to help regulate your emotional behavioral patterns. Again, it's going to be involved in thirst and hunger and satiation centers, and involved in the circadian rhythm regulation. It also is going to help control your body temperature. And last but not least, we have the epithalamus, which for our purposes is basically the same thing as the pineal gland. I mean, it's not, there are other things, but the pineal gland is a very large part of the epithalamus. And the pineal gland is going to secrete melatonin. And also it's going to be involved in olfaction by the habenular nuclei. So the thalamus is responsible for almost all sensory information with the exception of smell. All right, so let's talk about the cerebrum. So cerebral cortex is going to be comprised of gray matter, which has billions and billions of neurons in them. And there's a lot of different identifying markers, including gyri, which is our fissures, and sulcus or sulci. These are all plural forms, so it would be a gyrus, a fissure, or a sulcus as individual. And you can identify them on different regions of the cortex. It's approximately 2 to 4 millimeters thick, and beneath that, we're going to have, so the gray matter is on the outside. Beneath that, we're going to have the cerebral white matter. And that's going to have a bunch of tracts that connect parts of the brain with itself and other parts of the spinal column. And we have a bundle of white matter tracts that's called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a connective tract that's going to connect the right and the left hemispheres of the cerebrum. All right, and that's how we're going to have communication between these two regions. So it's a white matter band that's going to allow communication between the left and the right hemispheres. Now, if we're looking at the cerebral cortex, this is what a gyrus looks like, a little bulb. A sulcus is going to be like kind of like this. And then you can also have a fissure. A fissure is going to be like a nice long, deep, almost like a canyon. Now on the outside, again, we're going to have 2 to 4 millimeters of gray matter, again with billions and billions of neurons, and then directly underneath that, so that's here, 2 to 4 millimeters, then we're going to have the white matter underneath that. Each of the cerebral hemispheres is going to be divided into 4 separate lobes or fissures. So here's our hemispheres. The left and the right hemisphere would be divided right here by the longitudinal fissure. And then we also are going to have these 4 lobes that are divided as well. That's called the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital lobes. All right, and the lateral cerebral sulcus is what separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe, which is not actually shown here. All right, the parietal occipital sulcus separates the parietal from the occipital lobe, so that's going to be the sulcus here. And then there's actually a 5th part of the cerebrum, which is the insula, which we can't see here. It's going to lie very, very deep. And it's going to be in the parietal, frontal, and temporal lobes, but we're not going to be able to see it from the external view, so we're not going to be able to have external visualization. Okay, so this is going to be what I was talking about. The cerebrum is divided into these major lobes. Here's the frontal lobe here. Here is the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the reason you couldn't see the temporal lobe in the previous view is because it's actually going to be kind of on the side here. So here's the temporal lobe, and we have multiple different sulci that are going to separate that out. So the lateral cerebral sulcus is going to separate the frontal from the temporal lobe, and then we have the central sulcus, which is going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and then here's the parietal occipital sulcus, which separates out the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And then at the very back here, we have a transverse fissure, which is going to separate the cerebrum, which is all of this, from the cerebellum. Okay, so white matter is found directly under the cortex, and it's going to consist of myelinated axons that run in 3 major directions. So we have 3 different sets of fibers. That's going to include association fibers, which are here with the association tracts. You can see they're running in a totally different direction than the commissural fibers, which are here, and the projection fibers, which are shown. So the commiseration and the projection tracts, and they're all running in different directions. So the projection fibers are going to send impulses from the cerebrum to lower parts of the brain and spinal cord, whereas the commissural fibers are going to connect gyri from one cerebral hemisphere to the corresponding gyri in the opposite hemisphere, so left and right. And then association fibers are going to connect and transmit impulses between gyri in the same hemisphere. So instead of going left to right, we're going to be going left, left, right to right. And so these are different ways in which the cerebral white matter are able to communicate with one another by these neural tracts, basically, that look like that. Okay, we also have basal nuclei. Basal nuclei are found in the cerebrum, and these are basically paired masses or bunches of gray matter that are found in each of the cerebral hemispheres. And there's a region called the claustrum, which is a thin sheet of matter. It's going to be gray matter that's found right in a region called the putamen, which I don't see depicted here at all. And these basal nuclei, they're paired, they're on each side, one for each side, and the functions are going to include the initiation and termination of movements. This is what gets things started and stops different motions of your skeletal muscle. Now, we don't know exactly what the function of the claustrum is, but we think that it has to do a little bit with visual attention. And then another function, another function of the basal nuclei can involve regulation of muscle tone and control of the contraction of skeletal muscles, such as swinging your arms around while you are walking. Sorry about that. My computer is beeping at me. I got to get it plugged in. There we go. All right, so moving on, we're talking about the limbic system. So the limbic system is going to include parts of the cerebral hemispheres and also the diencephalon. So it's found in the cerebral hemispheres, and it's going to be involved with emotions and with memory. It's going to include regions like the amygdala, which is involved in emotions, and the hippocampus, which is involved in formation of your, so here's the amygdala here, and the hippocampus there, and the hippocampus is going to be involved in the formation of long-term memory. So basically, the limbic system is functioning in emotion and also in the formation and retention of your memories. So we have different types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals that are coming in and being processed in different regions of the cerebral cortex. So we have the sensory area. It's going to be taking sensory information, the motor area, and the association area. So the sensory areas are going to be concerned with reception and interpretation of sensory impulses. Some important sensory areas include the primary somatosensory area, the primary visual area, the primary auditory area, and the primary olfactory area, and the primary gustatory area. We also have motor areas. The motor areas are very important in governing muscular motion. Some of the motor areas include the primary motor area, which is involved in voluntary contractions of different skeletal muscles, and the Broca's speech area, which coordinates the muscles of speech. We also are going to have the association areas. Somatosensory association areas allow you to recognize an object by touch, so you don't have to visually see it. You can put your hand into a box and recognize that is a pencil, for example. The visual association area allows you to recognize an object by looking at it, so you can recognize it as a pencil without having to touch it. And the auditory area allows you to recognize a particular sound as speech, music, or noise. Additionally, it also allows you to identify the speaker if you're used to having heard that person's voice before. And we have an area called the Wernicke area, which is also involved in cognition of auditory stimulation, but it's basically going to help interpret the meaning of specific words. So instead of just hearing the different sounds that are coming together, you can turn that into a word and associate that word with a meaning, and that's the Wernicke area. Another association area is the premotor area, which is where you're able to store all of the learned activities that you may have previously done. Like someone says, oh, it's as easy as riding a bike. And even though you haven't done it in 10 years, you can still hop on a bike and ride it. Or, for example, if you learned to play the piano as a child, you can probably still pluck out a couple of tunes if you sit down in front of one. And that's all going to be from the premotor area. We also have a region called the prefrontal cortex, involved in your personality, your judgment, your future planning. So instead of just thinking for today, thinking about tomorrow and the future, and development of abstract ideas. So bigger thinking, all of that's going to come from the prefrontal cortex. All right. I know that was a lot. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on all of the different regions, but I want you to understand conceptually which area is responsible for different types of, well, what we would consider to be human characteristics or human behaviors. So we have something called hemispheric lateralization, which is basically the differences between the right and the left hemispheres. And you may hear that someone's like, oh, I'm very right brain oriented, or I'm very left brain oriented, right? And if you're right brain oriented, you're going to be very good at space and pattern perception, You're going to be able to have very good spatial relationships. You might be really good with maps, for example. You might always know exactly where you are. But you also are probably a little bit artistic. You're going to have musical awareness and artistic awareness. You're going to be able to see that something is pretty, not just functional. And you also are going to be able to identify and discriminate against specific odors. Now, if you're a left hemisphere person, you're probably going to be very rational, very numerical. You have very good scientific skills. You're also very language oriented. So this is like art and music versus language and numbers and reasoning. So these two regions of the brain actually function to give the individual different capabilities. So that means is that they're not bilaterally symmetrical. That means that they look different, so they're anatomically different and also functionally different. So they are neither anatomically symmetrical nor functionally symmetrical, and that's called hemispheric lateralization. And in most individuals, both the Broca and the Wernicke's area are located in this left hemisphere, 97% of the time. Now, occasionally we do have that 3% of the population that has that Broca's and Wernicke's area or Wernicke's area located in the left hemisphere. But generally, the language, which is the Wernicke's area, being able to understand what's being spoken to you and not just hearing the word for the sound, but hearing the word for the meaning, that's going to be found here in the left hemisphere. Again, that's the Wernicke area. Okay, again, I'm never going to quiz you on this, but I want you to understand that we have different types of brain waves. And brain waves come from electrical potentials that are generated by the brain cells and are propagated, and they're recorded by something called an EEG. An EEG is going to demonstrate that we have 4 separate types of brain waves here: alpha, beta, theta, and delta. And alpha waves are present in almost everyone when you are resting with your eyes closed. So when you're either awake or resting with your eyes closed, but you're not asleep necessarily. But you're not really necessarily doing anything either. So beta waves are going to be when you have a lot of stimulus, when the brain is active, so when we have periods of sensory input or mental activity, etc. Theta is your emotional. This is your stressor. So when you get emotionally heightened, this is when your theta waves are going to jump up. And the delta waves are going to be most prominent while you are asleep. So resting, active, stressed, sleeping. We can use an EEG to diagnose different types of brain disorders to determine whether or not you have, for example, epilepsy or different types of sleep disorders, etc. And is also one way in which we can confirm brain death in individuals who have suffered severe mental trauma or actual physical brain trauma, not mental trauma like PTSD, but something like impact like a car crash. So I'm going to move on to cranial nerves here, but before I do, I want to talk about them kind of as an overview, and then we'll talk about them independently. As I mentioned, they are all labeled in Roman numerals, starting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. They go up to 10. That's going to include the olfactory nerve. It's a special sensory nerve that's involved in the sense of olfaction. The second one is optic. It's involved in the special sense of vision. The ocular motor has 2 different components. It's got a somatic component and a motor component that are going to be involved in motion. So, for example, the ocular motor is going to allow you to move your eyeballs and your upper eyelid with the somatic components. And then the motor components or autonomic components are going to allow you to constrict your pupil or adjust your lens for nearby vision, etc. So you have a couple of different things that you can do with this ocular motor that's going to allow you to have your sense of, not just your sense of sight, because that would be optic, but your sense of being able to focus, to be able to appropriately get the sight that you need to be able to send that in through the optic nerve. All right, as we move it on, here's trochlear. This is 4. It's going to be involved in the motion of the eyeballs as well. Trigeminal is sensory and motor, involved in touch and pain and sensation, all from the face, scalp, and oral cavity. That's going to include the teeth and the back 2/3 of the tongue. All right, it does not include the first third of the tongue. The motor or branchial nerves coming out of here are going to include chewing and the ability to chew and swallow, and also in control of the middle ear muscles. Abductans is going to be nerve 6. It's going to be also involved in the movement of the eyeballs. Facial nerve is nerve 7. It's going to be involved in the anterior 2/3 of taste. I apologize, anterior would be the front 2. So the trigeminal and the facial both get the front 2/3 of the tongue. They're going to be involved in taste and touch and pain from the skin in the external ear canal, as well as control the muscles of facial expression and your middle ear muscle again, and secretion of tears and saliva. So the facial nerve is what's going to allow you to go ahead and cry, or what's called lacrimonial ducts, right? So release of lacrimonial fluid or tears. We also have the vestibular cochlear nerve. This is going to be nerve 8. It's going to be involved in hearing and equilibrium. So the cochlear branch is involved in hearing. Vestibular branch is involved in equilibrium. As we continue through, so we actually, I apologize, I said 10, we actually have 12. So we have the glossopharyngeal nerve, that's going to be 9. We have vagus, that is 10, accessory 11, and hypoglossal is 12. The major function of the glossopharyngeal nerve is that posterior one-third of the tongue, so that back one-third, we're able to get taste from it. Also, proprioception from the swallowing muscle. So what does proprioception mean? That means what's going on and being aware of what's around you, which is very important when swallowing because you want to make sure that the bolus of food that you're swallowing is of the appropriate size so that you've chewed it enough to make it into a ball and that is actually going to be able to be something that you can swallow and not something that's too large. It's also going to be involved in monitoring blood pressure and your gases in your blood, so oxygen and carbon dioxide level, and touch, pain, and sensations, so thermal, so temperature sensations from the skin of the external ear and upper pharynx. Also involved in swallowing, as I mentioned previously, and in salivary secretions. The vagus nerve is going to be involved in several different things, including the taste from the epiglottis, which is the very back, also proprioception from the throat and the voice box muscles, monitoring of blood pressure, and also of your gases, your blood gases. It's involved in touch, pain, and thermal sensations of the external ear, and also sensations of your thoracic and abdominal organs. So this vagus nerve, even though it comes out of the head, right, it's a cranial nerve, it actually is going to innervate a lot of the inner belly area. It's going to get all the way to those gastrointestinal organs, and it's involved in respiratory passageways and can be involved in regulation of heart rate. We also have the accessory nerves, the accessory cranial nerve, that's going to be 11. It's involved in the movement of your head and also of your pectoral girdle. And last but not least, we have hypoglossal, that's 12, and it's going to be involved in speech, food manipulation, and swallowing. Oh, I apologize, that really got away of me here. So in order for you to remember that, it's a very, very strange mnemonic, but it's simple to remember. To touch and feel very green vegetables. Right? And that's just going to be in order: olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abductans, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Now, I am not going to ask you to memorize which of these nerves is what number, but I do want you to have an idea of which of these nerves is responsible for which functions. All right, so let's talk about them independently now. So let's talk about the first. Here we have the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is going to be running here. It goes across what's called a cribriform plate. So let's talk about the sense of smell for a second, even though I know that that's a little bit more advanced than what we were talking about here. Basically what happens is we have small little bits of information that's going to come, little food particles or rotten trash, for example, whatever it is, going to be inhaled through the nose. And then it's going to bind to the different region here of the olfactory. This is the olfactory epithelium. It's going to bind to the olfactory region of the cribriform plate, which then is going to get sent up through nerve impulses through the olfactory, into the olfactory bulbs and get sent out through the olfactory tract. Right? So olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, is going to be involved in the sense of smell. Optic nerve, this is 2. It's going to be involved in the sense of vision. And again, I'm going to be very, very brief here. We are going to go into this extensively when we talk about the special senses. But basically what happens is information comes in the form of light. And it's going to trigger either a rod cell or a cone cell or some sort of information comes through again in the form of light. Then it's going to trigger one of these cells. Those cells are going to pass information on to this nervous tissue in the form of these bipolar cells here. These bipolar cells are going to connect these sensory cells to the nerve ganglion cells, and that's going to then end up running up into the optic nerve and being passed through the optic tract, the optic chiasm, into the optic tract of the brain, where we're going to process that visual information. So the optic nerve is going to be nerve 2 for our cranial nerves. Ocular motor is going to be cranial nerve 3. And the ocular motor, trochlear, abductans are all going to control muscles that are going to move the eyeballs. So I'm going to kind of, I don't want to say skip, but we're going to talk about all 3 of these together. So the ocular motor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abductans nerve. And again, these are all going to be involved in different muscles of the eyeball that are going to allow you to look left, right, and focus. Right, so ocular motor, here we go. So we did the trochlear, IV, we did the trigeminal. All right, so here's trigeminal. So this is V. Trigeminal nerve is going to be responsible for touch, pain, and temperature sensations from the scalp and the face, also from the oral cavity, and it's involved in control of the chewy muscles, or the muscles of mastication here. All of those are going to run into the brain through the trigeminal nerve. The abductans, as we talked about previously, that's going to be responsible for moving the eyeballs as well. So that's part of this ocular, motor, trochlear, and abductans trifecta, basically. All three of these are involved in motion of the eyes. The facial nerve, nerve 7, is going to carry sensations of taste from the anterior, that's the back 2/3 of the tongue. I'm sorry, that is the front 2/3 of the tongue, right? Posterior would be the back third. So the front 2/3 of the tongue are going to be carried here by the facial nerve. And it's going to control facial expressions and secretion of both tears and saliva, so salivation. And the vestibular cochlear nerve is the nerve 8. It's responsible for two different things, both hearing and equilibrium. So as you may notice when we talk about the cochlea, and we're not there yet, that's going to be the sensation of hearing. But when we get there, we'll talk about the fact that it has two different things that it does. So this here is the cochlea, the spiral organ here. This is where sound is amplified and then sent into the cochlear branch of the cochlear nerve and then interpreted as sound. But the vestibular branch, you may notice, has three separate, well, you can only see two here, but there's three separate branches that go in different directions, and they're responsible for all your directionality. So one is going to go up and down, one goes left and right, and the other is for rotational motion. And in this way, by getting information from all three of them, you can tell exactly where you are oriented compared to everything around you. And so that's going to be your sense of equilibrium. So that's going to go through here, the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, and then again into the brain, where we can interpret whether or not, for example, you're moving or staying stationary. We also have the glossopharyngeal nerve. That's going to be responsible for carrying taste sensations from that posterior region, the very back 1/3 of the tongue. Also touch, pain, and temperature sensations from the upper pharynx, and is also involved in the assistance of swallowing, as you might imagine, because it's the back part of the tongue. The vagus nerve is nerve 10. It's going to carry sensations from all of the thoracic and abdominal organs. It's going to be responsible for assisting in swallowing, vocalization, and also coughing. And it affects smooth and cardiac muscle, respiratory, and digestive organs. So as you might notice, this is going to run all the way down. The vagus nerve here is going to run all the way down. It's going to service the liver, gallbladder, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, pancreas, lungs, etc. So it's going to service a lot of the organs of the inner body. All right, so the accessory nerve, that's going to be nerve 11. That innervates the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. So it's going to be responsible for like the pectoral right motion of your head and neck and innervation of the pectoral region. And then last but not least, we have the hypoglossal nerve, which is responsible for innervating the tongue, right? So it's going to supply all of the muscles of the tongue. So it's not involved in taste sensation per se, but it is involved in chewing and in swallowing because it's going to allow, and in speech, because it's going to allow your tongue to make whatever shape that you're trying to turn it into. All right, so I'm going to gloss over the developmental anatomy, so you might notice that I've limited those slides. Again, I do not ever test on development. If you have any interest in that, you can take a developmental biology class. But talking about aging in the nervous system, there are a couple things that are of interest, especially if you end up dealing with geriatrics. So aging results in the loss of neurons, right, and diminished neuron function. So a diminished capacity for the nerves that are present for sending impulses to and from the brain, and a slower ability to process that information. So it takes a little bit longer to process information as you get older. And also the conduction velocity slows down. So it's not only that it takes you longer to process information, but to relay that information as well. So something like stepping on a hot tack would take, or hot tack on a sharp tack or a hot coal would take a little bit longer for someone who's elderly to move their body off. It also, again, slows that voluntary motor movement, so it takes a little bit longer for them to go through every one of the processes, and it increases that reflex time. That's what I was talking about. It takes a little bit longer for you to remove yourself from something that might be injuring you. Additionally, there's a lot of degeneration that can occur in any of those different nerves that we talked about. And degeneration can cause changes in vision, hearing, so loss of vision, loss of hearing, loss of sight. And all of those can actually happen because of over or misuse, but also just from normal aging. Taste, smell, touch, and balance. Balance is one of the big ones in elderly people, particularly in elderly women, because of osteoporotic issues, right? So your balance falling as a younger person isn't as big of a deal. You might get a bruise, but as an older person, you might end up breaking a bone. So balance is going to be very, very important as we age. Some other disorders that can occur can include something like a CVA or a stroke, cerebrovascular accident. And they're classified into two major types, the ischemic, which is the most common type, which is basically what happens when you have a decreased blood supply, say you threw a clot or something, and so the blood doesn't get through. But you can also have hemorrhagic, which would be when we have a blood vessel in the brain that actually bursts open, and so there's not enough blood supply to that region. There's just blood pouring into the brain, but not getting to the cells. So either ischemic or hemorrhagic, but either one, those are going to be considered a stroke. You can also have a transient ischemic attack. And that basically happens if we have impaired blood flow to the brain for a short period of time, but then it's restored. Usually it only lasts a few minutes, but can sometimes last up to 24 hours. But if it gets to that point, then you're looking at something more along the lines of a stroke. But symptoms of a TIA are going to include dizziness, weakness, numbness, or paralysis in a partial region of the body. So partial paralysis, including drooping of the face, headaches, slurred vision, etc. So something very similar to what we talk about when we ask stroke patients to, for example, stick out their tongue to make sure that it's even, etc. And additionally, we can also have Alzheimer's disease occur, which is a neurological disorder that affects individuals generally over age 65, and it culminates into dementia and eventually can end up with other complications that arise, such as pneumonia or broken bones because they don't realize where they are and end up slipping off of a roof or something like that. And there are definitely some distinct things that occur in the brains of Alzheimer's disease patients, including loss of neurons, which secrete acetylcholine. And then additionally, the main one is that they end up with abnormal plaques, atherosclerotic plaques. They're beta amyloid plaques that are deposited outside their neurons and are going to prevent them from being able to have the correct relay of information. And they also have odd protein filaments that tangle. They're neurofibrillary tangles, and these can also, because they're found in the neuron region, also interfere with the relay of information. So that is going to bring us to the end of our talk today, and I really appreciate you sticking around for all of Chapter 14. Aloha, and I will see you all next time. Have a great day and happy studying.